There are two ways to access New Markets tax credits. The first, for individual projects, is for project sponsors to appeal to individual CDEs for a suballocation of tax credits that will close the financing gap that they are experiencing in their financing. It will be important to show that the project has a legitimate, what we call but for, so that the project cannot proceed but for the subsidy provided by the New Markets tax credits. For groups that have a pipeline of projects like banks or finance companies, it may make sense to form a CDE and apply for a direct allocation to the U.S. Treasury Department. In order to be certified as a CDE must be a corporation or partnership, so sole proprietorship is not an eligible entity to become a CDE. They must be for-profit entities. However, nonprofits can form for-profit subsidiaries when the time comes to actually deploy the credits. The reason it has to be for-profit is because the credits are returned for an equity investment into a CDE. We'll get to more of that later in this presentation. And most importantly, the CDEs must meet two primary criteria. The first is that they have a primary mission of serving or providing investment capital for low-income communities or low-income persons, and that they are accountable to residents of the low-income communities that they serve. The first requirement is fairly easy to meet. Most entities are startups that are applying for CDE certification, and there is a clause put into the Articles of Incorporation that specifically says typically that this entity is being established to serve low-income communities, and that's it. So that's one way to meet that requirement. More difficult is the accountability requirement, and by accountable, what this means is that the U.S. Treasury Department wants to see some oversight by people that are on the ground in the low-income communities and to provide some local insight into how the tax credits are deployed. And the typical way to meet this requirement is to have at least 20% of an advisory board that is populated by individuals that meet these requirements. And the CDE service area is established by the service area of its advisory board that is meeting this accountability requirement. For example, about 50% of the awards every year are made to national CDEs. The way that these national CDEs get the national service area is by employing or populating their advisory board with individuals that have a national scope. For example, people that are involved in national nonprofits that serve low-income communities, either in community health or potentially charter schools or other aspects of community development. That's a primary way. There are a lot of CDEs that are set up for a very local geographic area. For example, a single county in a state may then want to populate its advisory board with individuals that are involved on a county level in providing Head Start centers, for example, for free child care for low-income populations. And even a minister or pastor can qualify if their congregation is mostly low-income. Elected officials can qualify if their constituents are primarily from low-income census tracts as well. So it's important to look at the accountability requirements and establish an advisory board that meets these requirements. You can also meet the requirement by having at least 20% of your governing board be accountable to the low-income communities. So once certified, the CDE is then eligible to apply for a direct allocation of New Markets tax credits. The average award is around 45 to 50 million. And as mentioned, the CDEs then go to find projects to allocate these credits to located in low-income communities. And they're looking for very high impact projects, which we'll talk about more in the next coming slides.